Welcome to Thueringer. We continue reading now in Zane Gray's The Desert of Wheat, Chapter 5. But the danger, whispered the boy's mother with a shudder. I reckon there'll be a little danger, Mother, replied Anderson cheerfully. We've got to take our chance on Jim. There's one sure bet. If he had stayed home, he'd been fighting the IWWs. That trying moment passed. Mrs. Anderson said that she would see to supper being put on the table at once. The younger girls began untying the bundles. Lenore studied her father's face a moment. Jake, you run along, she said to the waiting cowboy. Wait till after supper before you worry father. I'll do that, Miss Lenore, drawled Jake. And if he wants worrying, he'll have to look me up. Lass, I'm only tired, not worried, replied Anderson as Jake shuffled out with jingling spurs. Did anything serious happen in Spokane? She asked anxiously. No, but Spokane men are alive to serious trouble ahead, replied her father. I spoke to the Chamber of Commerce. Sure exploded a bomb in that camp. Then I had conferences with a good many different men. Fact is, they ran me pretty hard. Couldn't have slept much anyhow in that heat. Lass, this is the place to live. I'd rather die here than live in Spokane in summer. Did you see the governor? Yes, and he wasn't as anxious about the Golden Valley as the Bend country. He's right, too. We're old Westerners here. We can handle trouble. But they're not Americans up there in the Bend. Father, we met one American, said Lenore dreamily. By George, we did. And that reminds me, there was a government official from Washington come out to Spokane to investigate conditions. I forget his name. He asked to meet me, and he was curious about the Bend. It's loyalty to the U.S., I told him, all I knew and what I thought. And he said he was going to motor through that wheat belt and talk to what Americans he could find and impress upon them that they could do as much as soldiers to win the war. Wheat, bread, that's our great gun in this war, Lenore. I knew this, but I was pretty blamed sober by that government man. I told him by all means to go to Palmer and to have a talk with young Dorn. I sure gave that boy a good word. Poor lad, he's true blue. And to think of him with that old German devil. Old Dorn has always had a hard name. And this war has brought out the German cussedness. Father, I'm glad you spoke well of the young man, said Lenore, still dreamily. Oh, you never told me what you thought, replied her father, with a quick glance of inquiry at her. Lenore was gazing out of the window, away across the wheat fields and the range. Anderson watched her a moment and then resumed. If I can get away, I'm going to drive up to see Dorn again pretty soon. Do you want to go? Lenore gave a little start, as if the question had surprised her. I hardly think so, she replied. It's just as well, he said. That'll be a hard ride. Guess I'll clean up a little for supper. Anderson left the room, and while Kathleen and Rose gleefully squabbled over the bundles, Lenore continued to gaze dreamily out of the window. That night, Lenore went early to her room, despite the presence of some young people from a neighboring village. She locked her door and sat in the dark beside her open window. An early moon silvered the long slopes of wheat and made the alfalfa square seem black. A cool, faint, sweet breeze fanned her cheek. She could smell the fragrance of apples, of new-mown hay, and she could hear the low murmur of running water. A hound bayed off somewhere in the fields. There was no other sound. It was a quiet, beautiful, pastoral scene. But somehow it did not comfort Lenore. She seemed to doubt the sincerity of what she saw there and loved so well. The moon blanched and serene, lonely and silent, beautiful and promising, the white acres of many waters, and the silver slopes and dark mountains beyond did not tell the truth. Way over the dark ranges, a hideous war had stretched out, a red hand to her country. Her only brother had left his home to fight, and there was no telling if he would ever come back. Evil forces were at work out there in the moonlight. There had come a time for her to be thoughtful. Her father's asking her to ride to the men country had caused some strange little shock of surprise. Lenora dreamed without thinking. Here in the darkness and silence, watching the crescent moon slowly sink, she did think. And it was to learn that she remembered singularly well the first time she had seen young Dorn, and still more vividly the second time. But the third time seemed both clear and vague. Enough young men had been smitten with Lenore to enable her to gauge the symptoms of these easy-come, easy-go attractions. In fact, they rather repelled her. But she had found Dorn's manner striking, confusing, and unforgettable. And why that should be so interested her intelligence. It was confusing to discover that she could not lay it to the sympathy she had felt for an American boy in a difficult position, because she had often thought of him long before she had any idea who he was or where he lived. In the very first place, he had been unforgettable for two reasons. Because he had been so struck at the sight of her that he had gazed unconsciously, with a glow on his face and a radiance in his eye, as of a young poet spellbound at an inspiration. And because he seemed the physical type of a young man she had idealized, a strong, lithe-limbed, blond giant, with a handsome, frank face, clear-cut and smooth, ruddy-cheeked and blue-eyed. Only after meeting him out there in the desert of wheat had she felt sympathy for him. And now with intelligence and a woman's intuition, barring the old, insidious, dreamy mood, Lenore went over in retrospect all she could remember of that meeting. And the truth made her sharply catch her breath. Dorn had fallen in love with her. Intuition declared that, while her intelligence repudiated it. Stranger than all was the thrill, which began somewhere in the unknown depths of her and mounted to leave her tingling all over. She had told her father that she did not want to ride to the Bend country, but she did want to go, and that thought flashing up would not be denied. To want to meet a strange young man again was absolutely a new and irritating discovery for Lenore. It mystified her, because she had not had time to like Dorn. Liking an acquaintance had nothing to do with the fact, and that stunned her. Could it be love at first sight? She whispered incredulously as she stared out over the shadowing fields. For me? Why, how absurd! Impossible! I only remembered him, a big, handsome boy with blazing eyes, and now I'm sorry for him. To whisper her amaze and doubt and consternation only augmented the instinctive recurring emotion. She felt something she could not explain, and that something was scarcely owing to this young man's pitiful position between duty to his father and love for his country. It had to do with his blazing eyes, intangible, dreamlike perceptions of him as not real, of vague, sweet fancies that retreated before her introspective questioning. What alarmed Lenore was a tendency of her mind to shirk this revealing analysis. Never before had she been afraid to look into herself, but now she was finding unplumbed wells of feeling, secret chambers of dreams, into which she had never let the light, strange, instinctive activities, more physical than mental. When in her life before had she experienced a nameless palpitation of her heart? Long she sat there, staring out into the night, and the change in the aspect of the broad spaces, now dark and impenetrable and mysterious, seemed like the change in the knowledge of herself. Once she had flattered herself that she was an inch of crystal water. Now she seemed a complex, aloof, and contrary creature, almost on the verge of tumultuous emotions. She said her prayers at night, a girlish habit resumed since her brother had declared his intention of enlisting in the army. And to that old prayer which her mother had prayed before, she added an appeal of her own. Strange, the young Dorn's face should flash out of the gloom. It was there, and her brother's was fading. I wonder, will he and Jim meet over there on the battlefield? She whispered. She hoped they would. Like tigers, those boys would fight the Germans. Her heart beat high. Then a cold wind seemed to blow over her. It had a sickening weight. If that icy and somber wind could have been traced to its source, then the mystery of life would have been clear. But that source was the cause of the war, as its effect was the horror of women. A hideous and monstrous thing existed out there in the darkness. Lenore passionately loved her brother, and this black thing had taken him away. Why could not women who suffered most have some word in the regulation of events? If women could help govern the world, there would be no wars. At last, encroaching drowsiness dulled the poignancy of her feelings, and she sank to sleep. Chapter 6. Singing of birds at her window awakened Lenore. The dawn streamed in bright and sweetly fragrant. The wheat field seemed a rosy gold, and all that open slope called to her thrillingly of the beauty of the world and the happiness of youth. It was not possible to be morbid at dawn. I hear, she whispered, from 1,000 slopes far and wide. At the breakfast table, when there came opportunity, she looked up serenely and said, Father, on second thought I will go to the band. Thank you. Anderson laid down his knife and fork, and his eyes opened wide in surprise. Changed your mind, he exclaimed. That's a privilege I have, you know, she replied calmly. Mrs. Anderson appeared more anxious than surprised. Daughter, don't go. That will be a fearful ride. Sure glad to have you, lass, added Anderson with his keen eyes on her. Let me go too, begged Rose. Kathleen was solemnly gazing at Lenore with the wise, penetrating eyes of extreme youth. Lenore, I'll bet you've got a new beau up there, she declared. Lenore flushed scarlet. She was less angry with her little sister than with the incomprehensible fact of a playful word bringing the blood stingingly to her neck and face. Kitty, you forget your manners, she said sharply. Kid is fresh. She's an awful child, added Rose with a superior air. I didn't say a thing, cried Kathleen hotly. Lenore, if it isn't true, why'd you blush so red? Hush, you silly children, ordered the mother reprovingly. Lenore was glad to finish that meal and to get outdoors. She could smile now at that shrewd and terrible Kitty, but recollection of her father's keen eyes was confusing. Lenore felt there was really nothing to blush for. Still, she could scarcely tell her father that upon awakening this morning she had found her mind made up, that only by going to the Bend country could she determine the true state of her feelings. She simply dared not accuse herself of being in an unusually radiant spirits because she was going to undertake a long, hard ride into a barren desert country. The grave and thoughtful mood of last night had gone with her slumbers. Often Lenore had found problems decided for her while she slept. On this fresh, sweet summer morning, with the sun bright and warm, presaging a hot and glorious day, Lenore wanted to run with the winds, to wade through the alfalfa to watch with strange and renewed pleasure the waves of shadow as they went over the wheat. All her life she had known and loved the fields of waving gold, but they had never been to her what they had become overnight. Perhaps this was because it had been said that the issue of the Great War, the salvation of the world, and its happiness, its hope, depended upon the millions of broad acres of golden grain. Bread was a staff of life. Lenore felt that she was changing and growing. If anything should happen to her brother Jim, she would be heiress to thousands of acres of wheat. A pang shot through her heart. She had to drive the cold thought away, and she must learn, must know the bigness of his question. The women of the country would be called upon to help, to do their share. She ran down through the grove and across the bridge, coming abruptly upon Nash, her father's driver. He had the car out. "Good morning," he said with a smile, doffing his cap. Lenore returned his greeting and asked if her father intended to go anywhere. "No, I'm taking telegrams to Huntington." "Telegrams? What's the matter with the phone?" she queried. "Wire was cut yesterday." "By IWW men?" "So your father says. I don't know." "Something ought to be done to those men," said Lenore severely. Nash was a dark-browed, heavy-jawed young man with light eyes and hair. He appeared to be intelligent and had some breeding, but his manner when alone with Lenore, he had driven her to town several times, was not the same as when her father was present. Lenore had not bothered her mind about it, but today the look in his eyes was offensive to her. "Between you and me, Lenore, I've sympathy for those poor devils," he said. Lenore drew back rather haughtily at this familiar use of her first name. "It doesn't concern me," she said coldly and turned away. "Won't you ride along with me? I'm driving around for the mail," he called after her. "No," returned Lenore shortly, and hurried on out of earshot. The impertinence of the fellow. "Mornin', Miss Lenore," drawled a cheery voice. The voice and the jingle of spurs behind her told Lenore of the presence of the best liked of all her father's men. "Good morning, Jake. Where's my dad?" "Wal, he's with Adams, and I wouldn't be Adams for no money," replied the cowboy. "Neither would I," laughed Lenore. "Reckon you ain't riding this mornin'. You sure look powerful fine, Miss Lenore, but you can't ride in that dress." "Jake, nothing but an aeroplane would satisfy me today." "Want to fly, hey? Wal, excuse me from them birds. I seen one, and that's enough for me. And changing the subject, Miss Lenore, begging your pardon, you ain't riding in the car much these days." "No, Jake, I'm not," she replied, and looked at the cowboy. She would have trusted Jake as she would her brother Jim. And now he looked earnest. "Wal, I'm sure glad. I heard Nash call and ask you to go with him. I seen his eyes when he said it. Sure, I know you never look at the likes of him, but I want to tell you he ain't no good. I've been watching him, your dad's orders. He's mixed up with them IWWs. But that ain't what I mean. I... "Thank you, Jake," replied Lenore as the cowboy floundered. "I appreciate your thought of me, but you needn't worry." "I was worrying a little," he said. "You see, I know men better'n your dad, and I reckon this Nash would do anything." "What's father keeping him for?" "Wow, Anderson wants to find out a lot about that IWW, and he ain't above taking risks to do it either." The stable boys and men Lenore passed all had an eager good morning for her. She often boasted to her father that she could run many waters as well as he. Sometimes there were difficulties that Lenore had no little part in smoothing over. The barns and the corrals were familiar places to her, and she insisted upon petting every horse, in some instances to Jake's manifest concern. "Some of them bosses are bad," he insisted. "And to be sure they are, when wicked cowboys cuff and kick them," replied Lenore laughingly. "Well, if I'm a wicked, I'm a going to war," said Jake reflectively, "and them Germans bother me." "But Jake, you don't come in the draft age, do you?" "And just how old do you think I am?" "Sometimes about 14, Jake." "Much obliged. Well, the fact is I'm over age, but I'll gamble I can pack a gun and shoot as straight and eat as much as any young feller." "I'll bet so too, Jake, but I hope you won't go. We absolutely could not run this ranch without you." "Sure, I knew that. Why, then, I reckon I'll hang around till you're married, Miss Lenore," he drawled. Again the scarlet mantled Lenore's cheeks. "Good. We'll have many harvests then, Jake, and many rides," she replied. "Oh, I don't know," he began. But Lenore ran away so that she could hear no more. "What's the matter with me that Jake should," she began, and ended with a hand on each soft, hot cheek. There was something different about her that seemed certain, and if her eyes were as bright as the day, with its deep blue and white clouds and shining green and golden fields, then anyone might think that what he liked and have proof for his tormenting. But married? I? Not much. Do I want a husband getting shot? The path Lenore trod so lightly led along a great peach and apple orchard where the trees were set far apart and the soil was cultivated, so that not a weed nor a blade of grass showed. The fragrance of fruit in the air, however, did not come from this orchard, for the trees were young and the reddening fruit rare. Down the wide aisles she saw the thick and abundant green of the older orchards. At length Lenore reached the alfalfa fields, and here among the mounds of newly cut hay that smelled so fresh and sweet, she wanted to roll and she had to run. 2 great wagons with 4 horses each were being loaded. Lenore knew all the workmen except one. Silas Warner, an old gray-headed farmer, had been with her father as long as she could remember. "Whar you goin', lass?" he called as he halted to wipe his red face with a huge bandana. "It's too hot to run away you're a-doin'." "Oh, Silas, it's a grand morning," she replied. "Why, so 'tis. Pitchin' hay hyar made me think it was hot," he said as she tripped on. "Now, lass, don't go up to the wheat fields." But Lenore heard heedlessly, and she ran on till she came to the uncut alfalfa, which impeded her progress. A wonderful space of green and purple stretched away before her, and into it she waded. It came up to her knees, rich, thick, soft, and redolent of blossom and ripeness. Hard tramping it soon got to be. She grew hot and breathless, and her legs ached from the force expended in making progress through the tangled hay. At last she was almost across the field, far from the cutters, and here she flung herself to roll and lie flat and gaze up through the deep azure of the sky wonderingly, as if to penetrate its secret. And then she hid her face in the fragrant thickness that seemed to force a whisper from her. "I wonder, how will I feel when I see him again? Oh, I wonder." The sound of the whispered words, the question, the inevitableness of something involuntary, proved traitors to her happy dreams, her assurance, her composure. She tried to burrow under the hay to hide from that tremendous bright blue eye, the sky. Suddenly she lay very quiet, feeling the strange glow and throb and race of her blood, sensing the mystery of her body, trying to trace the thrills, to control this queer, tremulous internal state. But she found she could not think clearly, she could only feel, and she gave up trying. It was sweet to feel. She rose and went on. Another field lay beyond, a gradual slope covered with a new growth of alfalfa. It was a light green, a contrast to the rich darkness of the ad behind her. At the end of this field ran a swift little brook, clear and musical, open to the sky in places, and in others hidden under flowery banks. Birds sang from invisible coverts, a quail sent up clear flute-like notes, and a lark caroled seemingly out of the sky. Lenore wet her feet crossing the brook, and climbing the little knoll above, she sat down upon a stone to dry them in the sun. It had a burn that felt good. No matter how hot the sun ever got there, she liked it. Always there seemed air to breathe, and the shade was pleasant. From this vantage point, a favorite one with Lenore, she could see all the alfalfa fields, the hill crowned by that beautiful white and red house, the acres of garden, and the miles of orchards. The grazing and grain fields began behind her. The brook murmured below her, and the birds sang. She heard the bees humming by. The air out here was clear of scent of fruit and hay, and it bore a drier odor, not so sweet. She could see the workmen, first those among the alfalfa, and then the men and women too, bending over on the vegetable gardens. Likewise, she could see the gleam of peaches, apples, pears, and plums, a colorful and mixed gleam, delightful to the eye. Wet or dry, it seemed that her feet refused to stay still, and once again she was wandering. A gray, slate-colored field of oats invited her steps, and across this stretch she saw a long yellow slope of barley where the men were cutting. Beyond waved the golden fields of wheat. Lenore imagined that when she reached them, she would not desire to wander farther. There were 2 machines cutting on the barley slope, one drawn by 8 horses and the other by 12. When Lenore had crossed the oat field, she discovered a number of strange men lounging in the scant shade of a line of low trees that separated the fields. Here she saw Adams, the foreman, and he espied her at the same moment. He had been sitting down talking to the men, and once he rose to come toward Lenore. "Is your father with you?" he asked. "No, he's too slow for me," replied Lenore. "Who are these men?" "They're strangers looking for jobs." "IWW men?" queried Lenore in a lower voice. "Surely must be," he replied. Adams was not a young nor a robust man, and he seemed to carry a burden of worry. "Your father said he would come right out." "I hope he doesn't," said Lenore bluntly. "Father has a way with him, you know." "Yes, I know, and it's the way we're needing here in the valley," replied the foreman significantly. "Is that the new harvester thresher Father just bought?" asked Lenore, pointing to the huge machine, shining and creeping behind the 12 horses. "Yes, that's the McCormick, and it's a dandy," returned Adams. "With machines like that, we can get along without the IWW. I want a ride on it," declared Lenore, and she ran along to meet the harvester. She waved her hand to the driver, Bill Jones, another old hand, long employed by her father. Bill hauled back on the many-branched reins, and when the horses stopped, the clattering, whirring roar of the machine also ceased. "Howdy, miss. Reckon this is a regular IWW holdup." "Worse than that, Bill," gaily replied Lenore as she mounted the platform, where another man sat on a bag of barley. Lenore did not recognize him. He looked rugged and honest and beamed upon her. "Watch out for your dress," he said, pointing with grimy hand to the dusty wheels and braces so near. "Let me drive, Bill," she asked. "Well, now, I wisht I could," he replied dryly. "You sure can drive, miss, but driving ain't all this here job." "What can't I do?" I'll bet you I never seen a girl that could throw anything straight, did you? Well, not so very. I forgot how you drove the horses. Now go ahead, don't let me delay the harvest. Bill called sonorously to his 12 horses, and as they bent and strained and began to bob their heads, the clattering roar filled the air. Also, a cloud of dust and thin flying streams of chaff enveloped Lenore. The high stalks of barley in white sheets fell before the clutter upon an apron to be carried by feeders into the body of the machine. The straw, denuded of its grain, came out at the rear to be dropped, while the grain streamed out of a tube on the side next to Lenore to fall into an open sack. It made a short shift of harvesting. Lenore liked the even nodding rhythm of the plodding horses, and the way Bill threw a pebble from a sack on his seat to hit this or that horse, not keeping in line or pulling his share. Bill's aim was unerring. He never hit the wrong horse, which would have been the case had he used a whip. The grain came out in so tiny a stream that Lenore wondered how a bag was ever filled. But she saw presently that even a tiny stream, if running steadily, soon made bulk. That was proof of the value of small things, even atoms. No marvel was it that Bill and his helper were as grimy as stokers of a furnace. Lenore began to choke with the fine dust and to feel her eyes smart and to see it settle on her hands of dress. She then had appreciation of the nature of a 10-hour day for workmen cutting 18 acres of barley. How would they ever cut the 2,000 acres of wheat? No wonder many men were needed. Lenore sympathized with the operators of that harvester thresher, but she did not like the dirt.